Pratique inglês todos os dias, ouça, fale, pratique e melhore suas habilidades linguísticas com a gente. Quando terminar, continue praticando no nosso app. É grátis. Link na descrição. Hora de praticar.
The detective wakes up early. The detective wakes up early.
O detetive acorda cedo.
The detective wakes up early. The detective wakes up early. The detective drinks a cup of coffee. The detective drinks a cup of coffee.
O detetive bebe uma xícara de café.
The detective drinks a cup of coffee. The detective drinks a cup of coffee. The detective checks the day's schedule. The detective checks the day's schedule.
O detetive confere a agenda do dia.
The detective checks the day's schedule. The detective checks the day's schedule. The detective puts on a badge. The detective puts on a badge.
O detetive coloca o distintivo.
The detective puts on a badge. The detective puts on a badge. The detective wears a plain suit. The detective wears a plain suit.
O detetive veste terno simples.
The detective wears a plain suit. The detective wears a plain suit. The detective grabs a notepad and a pen. The detective grabs a notepad and a pen.
O detetive pega bloco de anotações e uma caneta.
The detective grabs a notepad and a pen. The detective grabs a notepad and a pen. The detective checks the phone for messages. The detective checks the phone for messages.
O detetive confere o celular em busca de mensagens.
The detective checks the phone for messages. The detective checks the phone for messages. The detective reads new emails. The detective reads new emails.
O detetive lê os e-mails novos.
The detective reads new emails. The detective reads new emails. The detective leaves the house. The detective leaves the house.
O detetive sai de casa.
The detective leaves the house. The detective leaves the house. The detective drives to the station. The detective drives to the station.
O detetive dirige até a delegacia.
The detective drives to the station. The detective drives to the station. The detective parks the unmarked car. The detective parks the unmarked car.
O detetive estaciona o carro descaracterizado.
The detective parks the unmarked car. The detective parks the unmarked car. The detective greets the team. The detective greets the team.
O detetive cumprimenta a equipe.
The detective greets the team. The detective greets the team. The detective logs into the computer. The detective logs into the computer.
O detetive faz login no computador.
The detective logs into the computer. The detective logs into the computer. The detective opens the case file. The detective opens the case file.
O detetive abre a pasta do caso.
The detective opens the case file. The detective opens the case file. The detective studies the case notes. The detective studies the case notes.
O detetive estuda as anotações do caso.
The detective studies the case notes. The detective studies the case notes. The detective marks the date and time. The detective marks the date and time.
O detetive registra a data e a hora.
The detective marks the date and time. The detective marks the date and time. The detective checks the call log. The detective checks the call log.
O detetive verifica o registro de chamadas.
The detective checks the call log. The detective checks the call log. The detective listens to a voicemail. The detective listens to a voicemail.
O detetive ouve uma mensagem de voz.
The detective listens to a voicemail. The detective listens to a voicemail. The detective gets a new tip. The detective gets a new tip.
O detetive recebe uma nova pista.
The detective gets a new tip. The detective gets a new tip. The detective answers a call from dispatch. The detective answers a call from dispatch.
O detetive atende uma ligação da central.
The detective answers a call from dispatch. The detective answers a call from dispatch. The detective writes down the address. The detective writes down the address.
O detetive anota o endereço.
The detective writes down the address. The detective writes down the address. The detective heads to the scene. The detective heads to the scene.
O detetive segue para o local.
The detective heads to the scene. The detective heads to the scene. The detective turns on the car radio. The detective turns on the car radio.
O detetive liga o rádio do carro.
The detective turns on the car radio. The detective turns on the car radio. The detective calls the partner. The detective calls the partner.
O detetive liga para o parceiro.
The detective calls the partner. The detective calls the partner. The detective meets the partner outside. The detective meets the partner outside.
O detetive encontra o parceiro do lado de fora.
The detective meets the partner outside. The detective meets the partner outside. The detective shows the badge at the scene. The detective shows the badge at the scene.
O detetive mostra o distintivo no local.
The detective shows the badge at the scene. The detective shows the badge at the scene. The detective talks with the first officer. The detective talks with the first officer.
O detetive conversa com o policial que chegou primeiro.
The detective talks with the first officer. The detective talks with the first officer. The detective asks what happened. The detective asks what happened.
O detetive pergunta o que aconteceu.
The detective asks what happened. The detective asks what happened. The detective looks for witnesses. The detective looks for witnesses.
O detetive procura por testemunhas.
The detective looks for witnesses. The detective looks for witnesses. The detective takes photos of the area. The detective takes photos of the area.
O detetive tira fotos da área.
The detective takes photos of the area. The detective takes photos of the area. The detective looks for footprints. The detective looks for footprints.
O detetive procura pegadas.
The detective looks for footprints. The detective looks for footprints. The detective checks for fingerprints. The detective checks for fingerprints.
O detetive verifica impressões digitais.
The detective checks for fingerprints. The detective checks for fingerprints. The detective places evidence in a bag. The detective places evidence in a bag.
O detetive coloca as evidências em saco.
The detective places evidence in a bag. The detective places evidence in a bag. The detective seals the evidence bag. The detective seals the evidence bag.
O detetive sela o saco de evidências.
The detective seals the evidence bag. The detective seals the evidence bag. The detective labels the evidence bag. The detective labels the evidence bag.
O detetive etiqueta o saco de evidências.
The detective labels the evidence bag. The detective labels the evidence bag. The detective walks the scene slowly. The detective walks the scene slowly.
O detetive percorre o local lentamente.
The detective walks the scene slowly. The detective walks the scene slowly. The detective draws a quick sketch. The detective draws a quick sketch.
O detetive faz esboço rápido.
The detective draws a quick sketch. The detective draws a quick sketch. The detective notes the weather. The detective notes the weather.
O detetive anota as condições do tempo.
The detective notes the weather. The detective notes the weather. The detective notes the light in the room. The detective notes the light in the room.
O detetive anota a iluminação do cômodo.
The detective notes the light in the room. The detective notes the light in the room. The detective looks for a camera nearby. The detective looks for a camera nearby.
O detetive procura por uma câmera nas proximidades.
The detective looks for a camera nearby. The detective looks for a camera nearby. The detective asks for security footage. The detective asks for security footage.
O detetive pede as imagens de segurança.
The detective asks for security footage. The detective asks for security footage. The detective talks to the store owner. The detective talks to the store owner.
O detetive conversa com o dono da loja.
The detective talks to the store owner. The detective talks to the store owner. The detective talks to a neighbor. The detective talks to a neighbor.
O detetive conversa com vizinho.
The detective talks to a neighbor. The detective talks to a neighbor. The detective listens carefully. The detective listens carefully.
O detetive ouve com atenção.
The detective listens carefully. The detective listens carefully. The detective asks simple questions. The detective asks simple questions.
O detetive faz perguntas simples.
The detective asks simple questions. The detective asks simple questions. The detective asks for full names. The detective asks for full names.
O detetive pede os nomes completos.
The detective asks for full names. The detective asks for full names. The detective asks for phone numbers. The detective asks for phone numbers.
O detetive pede os números de telefone.
The detective asks for phone numbers. The detective asks for phone numbers. The detective asks for the time of day. The detective asks for the time of day.
O detetive pergunta o horário.
The detective asks for the time of day. The detective asks for the time of day. The detective asks where people were. The detective asks where people were.
O detetive pergunta onde as pessoas estavam.
The detective asks where people were. The detective asks where people were. The detective checks each alibi. The detective checks each alibi.
O detetive verifica cada álibi.
The detective checks each alibi. The detective checks each alibi. The detective looks for a motive. The detective looks for a motive.
O detetive procura motivo.
The detective looks for a motive. The detective looks for a motive. The detective looks for a weapon. The detective looks for a weapon.
O detetive procura arma.
The detective looks for a weapon. The detective looks for a weapon. The detective spots a torn glove. The detective spots a torn glove.
O detetive nota luva rasgada.
The detective spots a torn glove. The detective spots a torn glove. The detective finds a small fiber. The detective finds a small fiber.
O detetive encontra fibra pequena.
The detective finds a small fiber. The detective finds a small fiber. The detective sees a broken window. The detective sees a broken window.
O detetive vê janela quebrada.
The detective sees a broken window. The detective sees a broken window. The detective notes fresh tire marks. The detective notes fresh tire marks.
O detetive anota marcas de pneu recentes.
The detective notes fresh tire marks. The detective notes fresh tire marks. The detective studies the license plate. The detective studies the license plate.
O detetive analisa a placa.
The detective studies the license plate. The detective studies the license plate. The detective calls for a tow truck. The detective calls for a tow truck.
O detetive chama guincho.
The detective calls for a tow truck. The detective calls for a tow truck. The detective calls the lab team. The detective calls the lab team.
O detetive liga para a equipe do laboratório.
The detective calls the lab team. The detective calls the lab team. The detective asks the lab to rush. The detective asks the lab to rush.
O detetive pede urgência ao laboratório.
The detective asks the lab to rush. The detective asks the lab to rush. The detective thanks the officers. The detective thanks the officers.
O detetive agradece aos policiais.
The detective thanks the officers. The detective thanks the officers. The detective leaves the scene. The detective leaves the scene.
O detetive deixa o local.
The detective leaves the scene. The detective leaves the scene. The detective drives back to the station. The detective drives back to the station.
O detetive dirige de volta à delegacia.
The detective drives back to the station. The detective drives back to the station. The detective uploads the photos. The detective uploads the photos.
O detetive carrega as fotos no sistema.
The detective uploads the photos. The detective uploads the photos. The detective backs up the files. The detective backs up the files.
O detetive faz backup dos arquivos.
The detective backs up the files. The detective backs up the files. The detective prints a few pictures. The detective prints a few pictures.
O detetive imprime algumas fotos.
The detective prints a few pictures. The detective prints a few pictures. The detective pins photos on a board. The detective pins photos on a board.
O detetive prende fotos em quadro.
The detective pins photos on a board. The detective pins photos on a board. The detective draws a simple timeline. The detective draws a simple timeline.
O detetive desenha uma linha do tempo simples.
The detective draws a simple timeline. The detective draws a simple timeline. The detective marks key places on a map. The detective marks key places on a map.
O detetive marca pontos-chave em mapa.
The detective marks key places on a map. The detective marks key places on a map. The detective makes a list of leads. The detective makes a list of leads.
O detetive faz uma lista de pistas.
The detective makes a list of leads. The detective makes a list of leads. The detective checks each lead. The detective checks each lead.
O detetive verifica cada pista.
The detective checks each lead. The detective checks each lead. The detective calls a witness again. The detective calls a witness again.
O detetive liga novamente para uma testemunha.
The detective calls a witness again. The detective calls a witness again. The detective sets up an interview. The detective sets up an interview.
O detetive marca uma entrevista.
The detective sets up an interview. The detective sets up an interview. The detective books the interview room. The detective books the interview room.
O detetive reserva a sala de entrevistas.
The detective books the interview room. The detective books the interview room. The detective brings water for the guest. The detective brings water for the guest.
O detetive leva água para o entrevistado.
The detective brings water for the guest. The detective brings water for the guest. The detective turns on the recorder. The detective turns on the recorder.
O detetive liga o gravador.
The detective turns on the recorder. The detective turns on the recorder. The detective states the date and time. The detective states the date and time.
O detetive declara a data e a hora.
The detective states the date and time. The detective states the date and time. The detective states the case number. The detective states the case number.
O detetive informa o número do caso.
The detective states the case number. The detective states the case number. The detective asks open questions. The detective asks open questions.
O detetive faz perguntas abertas.
The detective asks open questions. The detective asks open questions. The detective keeps a calm voice. The detective keeps a calm voice.
O detetive mantém a voz calma.
The detective keeps a calm voice. The detective keeps a calm voice. The detective watches body language. The detective watches body language.
O detetive observa a linguagem corporal.
The detective watches body language. The detective watches body language. The detective asks for details. The detective asks for details.
O detetive pede detalhes.
The detective asks for details. The detective asks for details. The detective repeats key facts. The detective repeats key facts.
O detetive repete fatos-chave.
The detective repeats key facts. The detective repeats key facts. The detective confirms the timeline. The detective confirms the timeline.
O detetive confirma a linha do tempo.
The detective confirms the timeline. The detective confirms the timeline. The detective shows a photo. The detective shows a photo.
O detetive mostra uma foto.
The detective shows a photo. The detective shows a photo. The detective asks if the person knows it. The detective asks if the person knows it.
O detetive pergunta se a pessoa a reconhece.
The detective asks if the person knows it. The detective asks if the person knows it. The detective asks about a car. The detective asks about a car.
O detetive pergunta sobre carro.
The detective asks about a car. The detective asks about a car. The detective asks about a jacket. The detective asks about a jacket.
O detetive pergunta sobre uma jaqueta.
The detective asks about a jacket. The detective asks about a jacket. The detective ends the interview. The detective ends the interview.
O detetive encerra a entrevista.
The detective ends the interview. The detective ends the interview. The detective writes a summary. The detective writes a summary.
O detetive escreve resumo.
The detective writes a summary. The detective writes a summary. The detective saves the recording. The detective saves the recording.
O detetive salva a gravação.
The detective saves the recording. The detective saves the recording. The detective emails the file to the team. The detective emails the file to the team.
O detetive envia o arquivo por e-mail para a equipe.
The detective emails the file to the team. The detective emails the file to the team.
Obrigado por assistir. Inscreva-se no canal e ative as notificações para receber novos vídeos e continuar sua jornada no inglês.